Gordon Brown. And in the next 2 days, the party is looking to clear up its views on anti-Semitism once and for all. It's trying to decide on a definition of just what its members and MPs think anti-Semitism is. The subject has dogged Labour and particularly leader Jeremy Corbyn for years. Today, the party's ruling body meets to decide whether to adopt the internationally recognised definition of anti-Semitism in full, which is what Gordon Brown and other high-profile figures have urged them to do. And tomorrow, Labour MPs will vote on it. If you're a Labour supporter, what do you think they should do? Have a watch of this, a reminder of how Labour got here.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
The Labour Party has been struggling with allegations of anti-Semitism. Accusations that the issue isn't being taken seriously enough just won't go away. And it's shaken the party to its core.
It's about who we are, it's about what we stand for, it's about what makes us tick, it's about the soul of the Labour Party.
Most recently, the row's been about Labour's definition of what anti-Semitism is. The party came up with a wording for its new code of conduct in July. It's clear in the code that anti-Semitism is racism, and it endorses the widely recognised definition set out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, also known as the IHRA. It describes anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred. It also sets out 11 examples of anti-Semitism. And here's where the controversy lies. Critics say Labour's left 4 of these examples out of its policy, all of which relate to Israel. Those examples are accusing Jewish people of being more loyal to Israel than their home country, claiming that Israel's existence as a state is a racist endeavour, requiring higher standards of behaviour from Israel than other nations, and comparing contemporary Israeli policies to those of the Nazis. Some who oppose adopting those examples word for word say it could restrict what they claim is legitimate criticism of Israel. Labour has insisted almost all of those missing examples were addressed elsewhere in the guidelines.
We have to deal with anti-Semitism in our society, including in the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and that is exactly what we're doing.
But many Jewish groups and Labour MPs are unhappy.
The idea that it should be the Labour Party defining what anti-Semitism is frankly unfathomable.
Meanwhile, the IHRA says if organisations can change its definition to suit their own needs, anti-Semitism will go unaddressed.
Well, let's talk to our political guru, Norman Smith, who is at Westminster. So is the ruling body going to accept the definition in full with all its examples?
Yes, but there's a but, and the but is they are likely to attach to that their own caveat, addendum, a note, which will enshrine the right of people to freely express criticism of the Israeli government and Israeli policies. Now, at one level, you might say, so what's all the fuss about? That's the whole anti-Semitism row sorted out. Only it isn't really, because for many in the Jewish community, this is no longer a wrangle about wording or legal texts or addendums. It's become a sort of emblematic row. And their take, basically, is they want Mr. Corbyn to accept the definition and the examples as it is, with no ifs or buts, no humming and hawing. Just accept it is their message to him, because they feel failure to do so sort of compounds the sense that he's just not listening to the Jewish community, he's not engaging with them. They maintain the current code freely enables people to criticise the Israeli government already, but above all, I think their real annoyance, anger, is the slight sense that the Labour Party is almost sort of finger-wagging at the Jewish community, saying, well, you have your definition, but actually it's not quite good enough. We've got a better idea of what the definition should be, and I think that means that the row is almost certainly going to carry on.
Thank you very much. Let's speak now to Richard Burden, a Labour MP from Birmingham, who says it's OK that the Labour Party has clarified the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. He believes caveats are needed so as not to prevent criticism of Israel. Also with us, Stephen Kinnock, Labour MP for Aberavon, who thinks Labour should adopt the IHRA definition in full without modifying any of the language. Also with us, 3 Labour voters: Sandra Godley, who is from Coventry, Nathan Baroda, He's from Bury. He's a member of the Labour Party and also an activist for the Jewish Labour movement, which has been critical of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership on this issue. And Yvonne Harvell, who is from London, a member of Momentum. That's the grassroots Labour group which supports Jeremy Corbyn. Welcome all of you. Thank you for coming on the programme. Richard Burden, are you effectively saying to the Jewish community that Labour knows best when it comes to defining anti-Semitism?
No, the key thing here, and I think the quote from Gordon Brown that you had in your opening package underlined this, is whether or not we are serious and tackle anti-Semitism.
But you
as
think,
we would about
you think it's OK for the ruling body to amend the definition and some of the examples and caveats?
Well, I don't think, as far as I know, I've not seen what the National Executive Committee is going to decide on today. But as far as I'm aware, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is likely to be adopted in full without modification, but there may be some caveats added to it.
Well, that's called modification.
It isn't modification. In 2016, the Home Affairs Select Committee, cross-party committee of the House of Commons, looked in detail at this issue about how you tackle anti-Semitism most effectively. Its report was welcomed across the piece, including by the Jewish community. And what it said is that the UK government and other organisations should adopt the IHRA definition, but they also suggested 2 additional caveats to ensure that freedom of speech and the right to criticise Israel was protected, because sadly there have been attempts to stifle freedom of speech by invoking the IHRA definition.
Okay.
I don't think the authors of the definition intended that,
no,
but
what
sadly
the IHRA does say is adding or removing language undermines the months of international diplomacy and academic rigour that led to this definition, which has been adopted by 31 countries.
I haven't seen that quote from the IHRA. I have seen
I'm telling you that's
that
what they say.
quote from some members of the UK delegation to the IHRA. But what I can say is that the author of that definition, which started out life, not with the IHRA, but with an EU body called the EU Monitoring Committee Against Racism, he himself has warned against the simple adoption of this code without any caveats, and he himself has warned about the possible threat to freedom of speech from it.
Stephen Kinnock, what is wrong with adding a caveat to make it absolutely clear that it's not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel?
I think what's wrong with it is it's up to the Jewish community to define what anti-Semitism means. And we have an IHRA definition which has been accepted by more or less every country in the world, by the devolved administrations, even by our own Crown Prosecution Service. So I think that definition is the right one to go with. But there's also, of course, a political dimension to this, which is as soon as you look like you're humming or hawing ifs and buts, and also somehow trying to lecture the Jewish community about how they define this issue, you're putting the Labour Party in a very difficult position, and I don't think it's a position that we should be in.
There is a political dimension, of course. Adrian has emailed this. The anti-Semitism slurs against Jeremy Corbyn are tiresome. A blatant agenda-driven campaign weaponised by right-wing anti-Corbyn Labour MPs such as Stephen Kinnock.
I think we are never going to make any progress if we keep on saying that everything is a plot against Jeremy Corbyn, that this is personalised, that we're playing the man, not the ball.
That's the perception. That's the perception. And you haven't convinced people like Adrian that that's not what you're doing.
But I'm afraid that Adrian is deeply trivialising a fundamentally important issue about the Labour values that we all stand for. We are an anti-racist party, and if you start to conflate,
has made many public assertions saying that anti-Semitism is unacceptable.
Jeremy Corbyn spent his entire 30 years on the back benches speaking out for what he believed in, including being extremely critical of every single Labour leader that there was during that period. Those of us who believe in the power of the Labour Party as a force for good, the greatest force in the history of British politics, we also have a right to stand up and say what we believe. And what is absolutely clear is this has been a catastrophic mess from start to finish, and the mishandling of this issue is inflicting damage on our party. Then it doesn't matter who the leader of the Labour Party is. What matters is the future of our party that can actually put this country back together again. We should be 20 points ahead in the opinion polls. Instead, we have spent the last months and months and months engulfed in this awful crisis.
Do you agree with that, Richard Burden?
Well, I certainly think Stephen is right that the matter should not have been allowed to carry on as it has, and we should have addressed it much more decisively, much earlier. Excuse me, my earpiece keeps coming out.
Don't worry, I know it's a real pain. Apologies for that.
No, that's fine. But, you know, I think the key thing here is, are we serious about tackling anti-Semitism, whether it be on the left of politics or on the right of politics or in wider society? And the reality is that all racism is wrong. We don't have a definition of Islamophobia. We don't have a definition and don't argue about the words around colour prejudice. But nobody would seriously suggest we should be anything other than absolutely firm in our opposition to those things and in rooting them out.
But
and I don't think there's a cigarette paper between Stephen Kinnock and me on that commitment.
But if you want to send out a message, to members of the Jewish labour movements who are despairing of the way the leadership has handled the anti-Semitism controversies, then a way of doing it to show that you are serious is to adopt all the definitions, all the examples, and don't change any of the language.
Well, you know, I think the important thing here is to look for common ground. If we have common cause in tackling anti-Semitism and rooting us out, let us look to do that. And let's remember that the argument here is not about whether there should be any shilly-shallying around opposition to anti-Semitism, hostility towards Jews as people. It's an issue about how there should be discourse and what's acceptable discourse in relation to Israel and Palestine. And of course we should listen to what Jewish people say about that. That's absolutely important, that we give due weight to their views. But equally, we must give due weight to the other party to that conflict, and that's the Palestinians. They themselves have warned that unless there are some clarifications to these, to the examples given in the IRA definition, then they could be prevented from describing their oppression and their dispossession in the way they experience it.
Is there a feeling, I'd like to ask both of you this, is there a feeling amongst some that the caveats which Richard Burden has just described, which may be added today, are there to protect, for example, Jeremy Corbyn from any retrospective disciplinary action for alleged anti-Semitic comments he's accused of making in the past?
Well, I haven't seen these caveats, so difficult to comment on that. What I would say, I mean, I have huge respect for Richard and the work he's done on Palestine. I'm an active and vocal member of the Labour Friends of Palestine. I've been down there a number of times. I feel passionately about the awful things that the Israeli government is doing, the violation of human rights and political rights and economic rights of the Palestinian people. The definition in the IHRA has never made me feel constrained in the untrammeled criticism and attack that I have made on the Israeli government. So I think we've got to draw a very clear line in the sand here between what is legitimate criticism of the Israeli government and when it spills over into what is clearly anti-Semitism. And the 4 examples in the IHRA that the NEC wanted to drop are actually really important, and I would agree with every letter and word of them, and there's nothing in them which prevents me from criticising the Israeli government.
How do you respond to that, Mr. Burden?
Well, I have never felt constrained by, in my criticism of Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, but the sad fact is that the IRA definition has been invoked, clear examples to do that. Let me give you a few of those examples. There have been calls to outlaw comparisons between Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and apartheid. Now, you may or may not agree with those comparisons, but I say, should somebody be prohibited, expelled from the Labour Party for expressing a view like that? It's actually been argued that because of the IRA definition, that people should be prohibited from arguing that there should be sanctions against Israel because of its treatment of the Palestinians.
Okay, let's
now, again, you may or may not agree with those, that suggestion, but I honestly don't believe it would be right to prohibit it. And simply the caveats, and they're not my caveats, what I've recommended is to adopt those caveats that were discussed at length and welcomed in the report from the Home Affairs Select Committee in 2016.
Okay,
so
I'm going to bring in some voters. Yeah, 3 Labour voters who obviously want to see Labour win the next general election. I want to know what you want to say to these 2 Labour MPs.
Well, firstly, I'd say that the that Corbyn isn't an anti-Semite, and the paperwork that needs to be seen or not seen, I mean, it doesn't... The caveats, they do allow you to be able to speak about what's happening in Palestine and to criticise the Israeli government.
How do you respond to that, Nathan?
Well, I'd say to Richard that the caveats already exist within the IHRA definition. It says criticism of Israel cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. But also, more importantly, before the examples, before the 11 examples, it says context must be considered. In that case, context should be considered. So those caveats do exist. But today, it's more about adopting the spirit of the IHRA, which is allowing Jews to self-define what anti-Semitism is.
Right, so, and what do you think?
I agree with that. For me, this is about starting a conversation, because to the average person, I know a lot of Jewish people in the community I live in, and for them, this is a good way to start a conversation, but that's not the be-all and end-all. And so, yes, there should be an open, opportunities for open expression that add to this document as well. So I really believe we can't ignore the voices of 31 countries who internationally and globally have eyes on this as well, and experiences. For me, it's a no deal. Adopt it and let's move on and start the conversation from there.
Adopt it in full without any modifications, without any extra caveats?
Yes, because I think it's a good starting place, because there will always be different aspects, different thoughts and different experiences that you can bring to the table.
And if the party does that, do you think, if the party does that heal the rifts within the party?
No.
What do you say, Nadine?
I actually agree, but it's one step towards doing that. Obviously, Jeremy, you know, he did a video recently in August where he made some progress, but also it's important that he, you know, distances himself from some of the historic associations that he had, a bit like John McDonnell did with the IRA, which was important, but also to go and engage with the Jewish community, to go to Barnet, where we lost seats because of anti-Semitism, to come up to Bury. You know, if he comes up to North Manchester, I'll, you know, take him for a bagel and I'll show him the seats that we lost because of anti-Semitism, and that's really difficult.
So there's still more to do. You would agree?
There is more to do, but Jeremy Corbyn's constituency is very Jewish, and so is Diane Abbott's, and they all vote for Corbyn. He does a lot of things for the Jewish community.
Why are you frowning like that,
I don't
Nathan?
think you can say our community all votes in the same way.
Not all, but we are definitely Labour, and Labour wins every time. And it's not just because we're Labour voters, it's because we like what's in the manifesto. And what we see is that if the Labour Party as a whole would just get along with each other and stop all this infighting about anti-Semitism, which really isn't very big in the whole picture of things. It's less now.
Is that right?
Ooh.
It's less
Regardless,
now.
one anti-Semite is too many, so all this whataboutery about other forms of racism, which should be condemned, we should also tackle anti-Semitism. It's not one or the other, we should do both.
I still think as well, for me, Jeremy Corbyn still lacks that oratory value and ability to engage with people, to lead them. You know, his mistakes, laying a wreath, you know, endorsing, I guess, the mural that was out. You know, I just hear a man that's constantly catching up with himself and apologising, when actually he should be leading morally in a way that the people will want to follow.
OK. I want to ask Stephen Kinnock and Richard Burden about a man called Pete Wilsman. He was re-elected to Labour's ruling executive committee yesterday. He's a man who suggested that Jewish Trump fanatics were behind accusations of anti-Semitism, and who claimed he'd never seen anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Let's just have a listen to what he had to say.
And some of these people in the Jewish community support Trump. They're Trump fanatics and all the rest of it. So I am not going to be lectured to by Trump fanatics making up daft information without any evidence at all. So I think we should ask the 70 rabbis, where is your evidence of severe and widespread anti-Semitism in this party?
Pete Wilsman, he's now on Labour's ruling body. Richard Burden, he gets a vote on what anti-Semitism means to Labour. What does that say about the current state of your party?
Well, I think what Pete Wilsman said in that recording was outrageous. It was entirely wrong. I'm pleased that he apologised for it afterwards. But that kind of discourse really should have no place, I think, on our national executive.
But now he gets to vote on what anti-Semitism means to Labour.
Indeed, and he's apologised for those comments, and I hope he seriously examines why that kind of outburst that he came out with a couple of months ago has caused such offence.
Does he need to go on diversity training?
I think, as far as I know, he's agreed that that should be the case.
No, he hasn't. It hasn't happened yet. He apparently
No,
has a lot.
happened.
He has a lot of questions for the trainers.
Well, that might be the case. I've not spoken to him about it.
What does it say about your party, Stephen Kinnock, that this man is now on the ruling body?
What I find particularly worrying about that rant is that Jeremy was in the room when it took place, and I do think it's disappointing that he didn't intervene and to stop it. That's the kind of discourse, as Richard absolutely rightly says, that has no place on our NEC. I think it happened some days after the voting for the NEC had already started, and it's possible that if it had happened before the voting had started, he may not have got on the NEC. I think he got on by a very narrow margin.
But he's apologised for what he said. Do you accept that apology? Do you believe him?
Well, words are easy, so, you know, great, the apology is a start, but I think he needs to engage wholeheartedly in the retraining, and I think that it needs to be something that Jeremy also acknowledges. I think there's an extremely important leader's speech coming up in a couple of weeks at our party conference. I think you could argue one of the most important in the history of the Labour Party. Jeremy must get the tone and the content of that speech right, and he has to distance himself from the kind of rant that we heard there.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thank you.